We now have an oration by Pól Ruiséal.
Gurbagat Hamáis, Tá mana bhaocht an chuiste a thug cuireagam labhart libh an Sathaniomh an ábhar an spéisiúil seo ar fad. When I came here today, I took a look at the monument that's right here behind us. And actually, the four important risings from 1798 to 1867, and it's 1867 in particular, that's the year we're going to be speaking about. But all the risings since 1798 are right here depicted on the monument, starting and walking clockwise. Here you have 1798, just around the Emmet Rising in 1803, then 1848, the Young Irelanders, and 1867, right there. And all the names, Allen, Larkin and O'Brien, and the others, because there were some 40 people arrested in Manchester on that occasion. Many of the names are there actually imprinted on the stone, right there on the monument. So the monument is very, very relevant to my talk here today. So I'll do something on the background, then the contextual lead-in, then the actual event and events, particularly the event in Manchester. The three main actors, if you like, Allen, Larkin and O'Brien. The letters that they wrote just before they were hanged, and what the effect that had on the media worldwide, and then some conclusions, four conclusions that I wish to draw at the very end. So the song we've just heard, when I was a young girl, they are marching and drilling. Awoke in the Glenside sounds awesome and thrilling. They loved poor old Ireland, to die they were willing. Glory oh to the bold Fenian men. So it is nearly 100 years since Peadar Kearney wrote those words about the bold Fenian men, and a century and a half since 7 Irish exiles in New York City got together to do something which was revolutionary from the start. Revolutionary from the start in that previous Irish risings against English rule had begun as reform movements and had developed into physical force revolution only after reform was frustrated and/or the English occupation government had, often intentionally, provoked such action in order to be able to choose the time of action and to better quell it from their point of view. It is not emphasized enough, I think, in these talks that we give to explain what is the context and what is happening and how things came into being, that we are in the context here of total and utter occupation. It's total and utter coercion from a force not of this soil, of another country, which intended to force itself upon the culture of this country, and of course that would not go down. So that's a very basic, fundamental, I think, understanding, the understanding in regard to occupation of the country. Though the United Irishmen of 1798, Emmet 1803, they began as such reformers. Though the Irish Parliament, which had sat at College Green in Dublin, was achieved without revolution in Ireland, it was the result of intimidation by the Irish volunteers during the American War of Independence. Even this reform was corrupted and done away with by English bribery and intrigue, in the same manner as the Scottish Parliament in 1707. Daniel O'Connell's movement to repeal the Act of Union, though inherently and emphatically non-violent, was confronted by the threat of military action to visit slaughter upon those unarmed Irish people who might show up at his monster meeting in Clontarf. The Young Ireland movement, which took up arms in 1848, had its roots in reform, and the failure of the Rising in 1848, the locus of Irish revolutionary activity, had shifted from Dublin to New York. For the men who gathered in the law office of Michael Doheny of Tipperary, he was chairman of the Emmet Monument Association, The lesson of history was clear. Ireland had made progress towards freedom only through physical force or the threat of physical force. This was the cornerstone of the approach taken by the bold Fenian men, that is, the Fenian faith in confrontation with the British policy of total coercion. And one has to keep that in mind, because too often that is totally, I think, in these discussions, we lose sight of that. On Gorta Muar, the Great Hunger, so-called, of mid-19th century Ireland, which saw the population reduced by half, was proof of the necessity, as Wolfe Tone had said in the 18th century, to break the connection with England. John Mitchell would make the case in a most compelling manner that England had encouraged and aggravated the famine for the purpose of thinning the Irish population. The famine period of genocide would take on for the Irish from the mid-19th century onwards, and this is a point that I believe it takes on the same psychological significance as the Nazi period has or had for the Jews of the 20th and 21st centuries. A visionary elite of Irish exiles would seek to organise and train the Irish for the purpose of the future liberation of their homeland, in part through the agency of the Emmet Monument Association, that was the 69th Regiment of New York, had been brought into existence on the 12th of October 1851 with Michael Doheny as its first lieutenant colonel for the purpose of training Irish exiles for the future liberation of Ireland. Realizing that any activity in America would be futile without the cooperation in Ireland, the US exiles, quickly naming them Doheny, Mahony, Corcoran, Kelly, Roach, Byrne and Patrick O'Rourke, meeting in New York early 1858, reached out to their former comrades in arms at home, with the result that Joseph Denieff, Thomas Clark Luby and James Stephens brought the Irish Revolutionary Republican Brotherhood into existence in Dublin on St. Patrick's Day, 1858. So the IRB, which brought about the rising in Dublin and the proclamation of the Irish Republic during Easter week in 1916, can trace its origin to this band of 1848 Young Ireland exiles in New York City, meeting at 6 Centre Street. And I'll leave the detail, there's lots of details about it, I won't get into that. But the so-called Wandering Hawk, as he was called, James Stephens, he became the head of the IRB in Ireland, and the scholar John O'Mahony was head of the organisation in America. Now, John O'Mahony was also a Celtic scholar and an Irish language scholar, and he's well known for his translation into English of textbooks in medieval and early medieval Irish, and in particular, Geoffrey Keating's History of Ireland. He translated it from early classical modern Irish into English. Mahony, he was inspired by the example of Fianna, the elite National Guard of 3rd century Ireland. He coined the word Fenian for the Brotherhood in America. Soon the term Fenian and IRB became interchangeable. So with the end of the American Civil War then in 1865, the Fenian Brotherhood in America sent its most trusted military officer, Captain Thomas Kelly, home to Ireland to assess the prospects for a rising and to advise on military matters. By summer 1865, John Devoy was convinced that the time was ripe for a rising. The Fenian chief, James Stephens, was captured in Dublin, but Thomas Kelly, with John Devoy and others, rescued Stephens from Richmond jail, much to the consternation of Dublin Castle. And moving on, as Padraig Pearson would say in his oration at the grave of the Fenian O'Donovan Russa on Law Lunas 1915, the seeds sown by the young men of 65 and 67, the people whose names you can see here on this monument, are coming to their miraculous ripening today. And this, of course, would all bear fruit during Easter week of 1916. So da bhrí sin agriocht ná siúnach runde fe bhíonn díolseachta éireannach a ba bráthachas na poblachta nó bráthachas phoblacht na héireann, mar a létar Irish Republican Brotherhood as bíorna. Bhí an eagraíocht dírithe éiring a héire ó chuing hasanna, agus iad sásta las a bhaint as an lábhláidir agus as a bhur éigen leis a gospóir seo a bhaint amach. So in December 1866, James Stephens resigned from his leadership of the IRB. He was succeeded then by a veteran of the American Civil War, Colonel Thomas J. Kelly, originally from Galway. So he had as his second in command, Captain Timothy Deasy. So just remember those names, Kelly on the one hand, Deasy, also a war veteran. So there were by now a number of American Civil War veterans in Great Britain, including Captain Edward Condon, who came to Manchester in 1867 to rejuvenate the active Fenian groupings there, or circles as they were known at the time. So Condon became known soon as the main head circle organiser to the north of England, because England at that time had a huge Irish population, something in the region of 20,000 people were Irish or of Irish origin working in the Manchester area. So the Fenian movement was quite strong in Manchester, and it was being built up at this time in the 1860s. So one evening in September 1867, so we're moving into the actual year now, Kelly and Deasy were ambushed by the police after a meeting in Manchester. Deasy drew a pistol, but this was wrestled from him before he had a chance to use it. Kelly too was overwhelmed before he could use his revolver and was taken with his companion to the nearest police station. Once at the station, they were interrogated as to how they had arrived in England and what their business there was. The magistrate, with scant evidence, had no compunction in remanding them in custody for a week. Next week, Condon, who was the leader in Manchester, he was given the shock news that Kelly and Deasy were in the hands of the English police, and that it would not be long before the authorities discovered who these men really were. Condon immediately called a meeting of the local circles to consider how best to proceed. Assuming that the two Irish leaders would be remanded in custody after their magistrate court appearance, Condon reasoned that the only way to rescue them would be by waylaying the police van, taking them from the court to Bellevue Prison on the Hyde Road in Manchester. Those of you who know Manchester, it was in that area, the Hyde Road. At 3:30 on the 18th of September 1867, the van, with its accompanying policeman and prison warders, started out for Bellevue. The plan was that the rescuers would hide in and around the arches of the bridge and at a given signal launch themselves at the van, break open the rear door, free Kelly and Deasy, and then spirit them across the fields on the left and onto the Ashton Road, where Condon had arranged for a cab to be waiting to take the fugitives to a safe house in Ashton-under-Lyne, a suburb of Manchester. The van approached, and as the horses emerged from underneath the central arch of the bridge, two men ran into the road and attempted to force the van to a halt. These two men were Captain Michael O'Brien, 30 years of age, and the 32-year-old Michael Larkin, both armed with pistols. Despite Condon's strict orders, shots were fired immediately, and one of the two horses was hit in the neck, forcing the van to a complete halt. Immediately, a group of 20 Irishmen attacked the van, two of them climbing up on top of the van, where they were handed up heavy stones from the roadside. Then they proceeded to prise open the roof and thus gain entrance. While all this was going on, several more shots were fired, one of them hitting an onlooker named Sprosson on the foot, whilst PC Seth Bromley was wounded in the thigh, and I'll just leave it there, because there's a lot of detail in and around there, and I won't delay you on it. But meanwhile, amongst a mass of Irishmen struggling around the arches, the leader of the rescuers was seen to be William O'Mara Allen, a 18 to 19-year-old Irishman living along Rochdale Road and a joiner by trade. He carried a pair of pistols, exhorting his fellow rescuers to greater efforts and holding the crowd in check if they got too near. So inside the van there was controlled chaos. Sergeant Brett was trying to keep his charges in control, and although in this he was badly hampered by 3 women prisoners who'd been allowed to stand in the van corridor with him. The noise inside the van was loud, with repeated attacks on the roof and door, and several voices outside shouting to him to hand out the keys so that the rear door could be opened. This policeman Brett refused to do. "I must do my duty," he muttered to himself as he tried to look through the grille in the rear door, which someone was just attempting to deftly open with a stone. Suddenly, the barrel of a pistol was poked through the open grille and a shot rang out. Brett immediately slumped to the floor. Then there was a renewed demand from outside for the keys to be passed out. One of the women frantically felt in Brett's pockets and, discovering a ring with 3 keys on it, threw it through the grille, and in less than a minute, the rear door had been flung open, Brett's body falling out onto the road. "Kelly, DC," the words were heard dimly through the tumult. Here came the reply. Now, it was never ever ascertained as to who shot and killed that one policeman, because that was all that happened really in that event. There was one policeman that was killed, the only casualty of the whole, and the whole rescue was very, very successful. DC and Kelly were soon spirited away. They got away, and altogether over 40 Irishmen were arrested and imprisoned in the next few days, including Alan Larkin and William Gould, the false name given by O'Brien, Condon, calling himself Edward Shore, and a man named Thomas Maguire, a British Royal Marine, but Irish, on leave from his regiment. Kelly and DC were not among them. The brave rescue, and it was some very, very brave rescue, it had worked. Now, one of the 3, Alan Larkin and O'Brien, one of them, I was quite sure I was related to one of them. The O'Brien side of my family, and O'Brien, I was quite convinced that he was actually my great-great-grand uncle. But I must say, I've looked into it more, and in the last day or two, I discovered that I must look at it again, because it's not proven that I'm related to him. But I was very interested in Captain Michael O'Brien. His years are 1837 to 1867, patriot of the American Civil War on the Union side. He was also an Irish patriot, of course, Fenian, and a Manchester Martyr. But I'll just run through his story very, very quickly. Michael O'Brien was one of 8 children, one of the 3, Alan Larkin and O'Brien. And imagine that the ages of these guys they were so young. I mean, one was only 18, another 30, 32. They were the ages of them. But he was born at Ballymacoda, not very far from here, County Cork, where his father had rented a large farm, but in 1856 the family was evicted. He was described as physically as being a tall, square-shouldered man whose bearing bespoke an American soldier. In his youth, he was apprenticed to a draper in Youghal, and I found out the drapery where he worked in Youghal was in McCarthy's Drapery, and he later worked as an assistant in one of the large stores here in the city, in Cork. That store was Arnott's. So O'Brien would eventually emigrate to the United States. O'Donovan Russell wrote in his book Irish Rebels in English Prisons that he met O'Brien in 1859 and had also known him during his time in America, and had found him to be one of the truest, one of the noblest, as devoted as a lover, as courageous as a lion, as he described him. So in any case, when the 3 Fenians were before the court, following the rescue, over 40 innocent local Irishmen were arrested for questioning, as we have said. Ultimately, 5 Fenians were tried over 5 days and convicted of the alleged murder of Sergeant Charles Brett and sentenced to death by hanging. William Philip Allen, Michael Larkin, Michael O'Brien, Thomas Maguire and Edward Condon, Maguire actually the Royal Marine, these neither Maguire nor Condon had actually nothing whatever to do with the rescue. Maguire nothing at all, except the fact that he was Irish, and that was enough to cause his arrest. As we know, English justice, where the Irish are concerned, has changed very little, I'd argue. since 1867. You can just ask Jerry Conlon of the Guildford Four or the Birmingham Six, or so many other recent examples of Irishmen and Irish women being put into English jails and prisons, many having never even seen a judge, as was the case with internment without trial and diplock courts, but Shin Scéal Ella. So in any case, none of the other three, now two got reprieves through diplomacy, working with the American ambassador and American diplomatic service. Two of them, Condon and Maguire, were free, but not the other three. So none of the three, Alan, Larkin and O'Brien, got free, even though it was very possible that they would, because the witnesses in the cases of Maguire and Condon were found in the course of the court case to be unreliable, completely unreliable. But it was on their evidence that the hanging of the three, or the let's say the guilty pronouncement of the three, Alan, Larkin and O'Brien, was to rest. But in fact, all were innocent, and it was never proven as to who actually killed the policeman, who shot the policeman. So from that comes the term martyr. But of course the English needed, they needed heads on a plate, and the hysteria of the English public at the time was really beyond comprehension. Moving on then to the actual event itself. The event itself, the actual hanging, they were sentenced to be hanged. The date was the 23rd of November, 1867. It was a cold, damp, foggy morning, and just to be quite precise about this, it was 153 years ago next Monday. The exact date, 153 years ago. When the drop fell, Alan died instantly. But it was soon obvious that Larkin, that was the chap at age 32, and O'Brien were still very much alive, the drop having occurred. The drop had been too short and not infrequent happening at executions in those days, apparently, and the executioner, whom we have heard of before, William Calcraft, hurried below the scaffold where he coldly, callously hung his full weight around Larkin's legs to hasten the end. Satisfied that Larkin was now dead, he turned his attention to O'Brien, only to be forced away by a Roman Catholic priest, Father Gadd, G-A-D-D, who forbade the hangman to touch him. Father Gadd then stood in front of the suspended man, offering a crucifix to his twitching fingers, and there he stood for 3/4 of an hour until O'Brien breathed his last. And later he presided, the priest, over the burial of the three in quicklime in the unconsecrated prison grounds of the New Bailey in Manchester. In 1871, the New Bailey prison was taken down to make way for an extension to the Stalford bus train station, and the bodies were reburied at Strangeways prison, which opened in 1868. Their graves are now marked there solely by some drawings on a wall. But in 1877, an impressive memorial to the Manchester Martyrs was finally erected at the Catholic Moston, M-O-S-T-O-N, cemetery. The effigies of Alan, Larkin and O'Brien look down from the middle of this memorial, just below a large Celtic cross. But recently, just following the history and following those events through, in 1991, which is only about 20 years ago, the remains of our three heroes were exhumed once again and reinterred in Blackley Cemetery, Manchester. So that is, that takes that story that far. Now, all three executed members of the IRB, they were members of the IRB, they were born in Ireland. Just to recap very quickly, William Allen came from Bandon, County Cork, and was only 18 years of age when he died. In a defiant address from the dock, he declared, "I will die proudly and triumphantly in defense of Republican principles and the liberty of an oppressed and enslaved people." Michael Larkin, aged 32, he came from Banagher, County Offaly, was a tailor. He lived with his wife and family in Manchester. He was ill at the time of the raid, as it happened, and he struggled to escape from the scene. His comrades, Allen and O'Brien, were captured while helping to carry him across a nearby railway embankment. That was actually when the actual event, the rescue, was going on. Michael O'Brien, as I've already mentioned to you, aged, I see here, 31, from Ballymacoda, County Cork, previously lived in the United States, and he gained the rank of lieutenant in the US Army. An accomplished revolutionary, he lived under the pseudonym William Gould while in England. Now, what I want to do very quickly, I'm only going to take a few minutes, and then that's it, right? I'd like to look at some of the letters they wrote just before they were hanged, and then some short conclusions to the whole affair. On the 22nd of November, now that's tomorrow, 153 years ago. On the 22nd of November, 1867, William P. Allen wrote his last letter, this side of the grave, as a prisoner in Manchester, England. He was hours from being executed by hanging, a death that would take him and other heroes of Irish, would make him and other heroes of Irish nationalism for generations to come. And these are the words: I am dying an honourable death, the 19-year-old Allen wrote. I am dying for Ireland, dying for the land that gave me my birth, dying for the island of saints, and dying for liberty. Every generation of our countrymen is suffering, and where is the Irish heart could stand by unmoved? A 19-year-old. Such rhetoric wasn't new to the Irish cause. With these letters came from ordinary Irishmen suddenly thrust into making the ultimate sacrifice. But even as Allen and O'Brien made their motivating cries for Irish freedom, each man also evinced more everyday attachments to faith and family. Just a few words from a letter by Allen to his dear uncle and aunt. And he says, I suppose this is my last letter to you at this side of the grave. Oh, dear uncle and aunt, if you reflect on it, it is nothing. I am dying an honourable death. I am dying for Ireland, dying for the land that gave me birth, dying for the island of saints, and dying for liberty. Every generation of our countrymen has suffered, and where is the Irish heart could stand by unmoved? I should like to know what trouble, what passion, what mischief could separate the true Irish heart from its own native isle. Now, it's a long letter, and I'll stop right there. I can give you more. Anybody wants to read the full letter, I'll allow you to do that later on. O'Brien, and this is some words from O'Brien. That was Alan just now. O'Brien. When I leave this world, it will be with God's help to go to a better, to join the angels and saints of God and sing his praises for all eternity. I'll leave a world of suffering for one of eternal joy and happiness. Give my love to father and mother, Mary, Ellen, John, Tim, Catherine, uncles, aunts, and cousins. And when you go back and you do the research, I found those names. Looking at the family tree, those names are to be seen as well. I must say, much though I would like to live, that I cannot regret dying in the cause of liberty and Ireland. So O'Brien wrote to his brother in his last letter of the 14th of November to his brother. He said to his brother, I feel as confident of the ultimate success of the Irish cause as I do of my own existence. So neither Allen nor O'Brien could have imagined the impact their letters and their deaths would have on the Irish cause. Within days, however, newspapers in Ireland, London, and the United States reproduced the letters together and separately, one under a headline, A Voice from the Grave. Though their words were not as memorable as the courtroom cries of God Save Ireland, first uttered by co-defendant Edward O'Maher Condon, the letters helped spark the nationalist outpouring that would last for decades of genuine emotion and sincere feeling. It was T.D. O'Sullivan who quickly turned God Save Ireland into a nationalist tune, set to Tramp, 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 The Boys Are Marching, a battlefield ballad sung a few years earlier by Union troops in the US Civil War. But this was international. I mean, this was the press in the United States, in England, in Ireland, and on the continent as well. And one example of reverberation of this all happening on the continent is, look at Friedrich Engels. He, comrade with Karl Marx, immediately recognized the significance of the executions. as you know, Engels was founder with Karl Marx of modern-day communism, both German philosophers and political scientists. Engels wrote in a letter to Karl Marx a day after the hangings, on the 24th of November, 1867, the Tories had accomplished, this is translating from the German, the Tories had accomplished the final act of separation between England and Ireland. The only thing the Fenians had lacked were martyrs. Unfortunate circumstances have now created these. A series of motivational events which will now be sung about to every Irish babe in the cradle in Ireland, England, and America. So he saw the separation between England and Ireland coming very clearly after this, what he saw as a total and utter outrage. So the words and music of the Manchester Martyrs were soon shared in large public gatherings, and I have a whole list of the effect of this happened as it happened. I mean, the Irish community in Manchester marched a week after the executions, and more than 5,000 people attended a similar protest right here in Cork City. So at that time, 1867, the citizens of Cork, they were not going to take this thing lying down. Closer to 50,000 marched in Dublin on the 8th of December 1867. Large protest parades also took place in New York City and in Philadelphia through to the end of the year and into early 1868. So on it went. So on both sides of the Atlantic, this happened. But there's one comment I would like to refer to before I finish, and it's a comment during the Land War and Home Rule debates in the English House of Commons, 1887. Journalist and MP T.P. O'Connor, he wrote, "It is impossible to forget the impression the original event produced upon the Irish people. The execution of the Manchester Martyrs was a new birth of political convictions. The catastrophe came to crystallize impressions into conviction and to pave the way from dreams to action." One last extreme, I found it very interesting, this last one, what Parnell said about this, speaking in the House of Commons 10 years later. Parnell, the nationalist figure, he told the House, he says, Charles Stewart Parnell, "I wish to say as directly as I can that I do not believe, and never shall believe, that any murder was committed in Manchester." So I ran through a lot of that there. I have much more detail upon it, but the time is moving on, I know that. Conclusions. So the Manchester Martyr episode demonstrated that the inalienable, steadfast demand of Ireland to be independent and free, following the Irish Holocaust years of 1845, 6 and 7, was very much alive and kicking. The ein sé an tinne bheo mar a dúradh ag an am. So the event was a bridge, a revolutionary event happening between the risings of, and it's easy to think about the risings, 1641, the risings mentioned on the monument here above us, 1798, 1803, 1848 and 1867, right here on this monument. We as a population, as a whole, if you like, people living on this island, we were, I would argue, we were cowed and weakened by the so-called Great Famine or Irish Holocaust. But even though the 1848 uprising was unsuccessful, 1867 in itself and the events surrounding what happened that year reaffirmed that the Irish resistance was fully alive and was again able to carry out events in the context of Irish independence and freedom. And the event that we're now speaking about in particular was a very successful event, which must be noted. The last conclusion I have is this one, that it also affirmed the event of the Manchester Martyrs, that in the longer term, Ireland unfree would never relent or be at peace. Shechen, but Jokoch an Pirsche, Loegen, Isliegen. Vionish, an Flanaoil, Agus an Chanasir, Bew, Bahoa, Agus Near Royal, dan Voer Gespore de Villa Corigri, agus le slánú san nám a bhí roin amach. Tá manna bhaochttaí bhar fad as éisteachlam, chomfad a san, agus gám míle buchas gám míle buchas liv as teachta láthir an san jobh, tá buocht an gosta commóra an chuidedam an chaint seo thuair díomh. Agus san slánta go saolchomh, go mar se bhar fad céad bliain, ach go maire sprit na saoirse agus an íornas bleachas, beo in éiring go brach na bretha. Gur mágad.